Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite obviously had no real contribution to make to this very important bill, Mr. Speaker, which is before this Honorable House. And as the distinguished member from Nevis 10 intimated earlier today, this bill derived from extensive discussions between the legal teams representing on one hand the syndicate of lenders inclusive of the St. Kitts, Nevis and Gwilla National Bank. And this legal team includes Queen's Counsel, Anthony Gonzalez. Extensive discussion between the legal team representatives Casper, which also includes our distinguished senior counsel. I call her Lady Constance Mitchum of Mitchum and Benjamin, and she's here today. And of course, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, beg your pardon, the Attorney General's office. And the member from number 3 admitted, Mr. Speaker, that he was confused with the legal language, and I am paraphrasing here, Mr. Speaker. He was confused with the legal language in the bill before us. And of course, the member from number 2 was more than confused, because after being the lawyer for the National Bank for over 15 or 20 years, she does not even seem to understand what is a mortgage, Mr. Speaker. And for the benefit of the members opposite, and sometimes I really wonder if that member is a Liburd, my family, didn't understand what is a mortgage, Mr. Speaker. And a mortgage, for the benefit of those ordinary people whom she tried to confuse, in simple parlance, a mortgage is a legal agreement by which a bank lends money at an interest rate, Mr. Speaker, in exchange for taking the title of the debtor's property. It lends money in exchange for taking the title of the borrower's property, Mr. Speaker, with the condition that the conveyance of the title becomes void upon the payment of the debt. It's as simple as that. Very simple. Elementary, Mr. Speaker, and they don't seem to understand that. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite demonstrated the confused state of their minds, Mr. Speaker. When they opined, when they made the suggestion, Mr. Speaker, that the construction of a new cruise pier to accommodate 2 Oasis class vessels simultaneously at the same time, Mr. Speaker, makes no economic sense. Imagine that. Makes no economic sense, Mr. Speaker.
According to the
member from number 3, it says it leaves the welfare of the people behind, Mr. Speaker. But such a proposition borders on absurdity, Mr. Speaker. Because, in fact, Mr. Speaker, tourism on its own has what it is called a cascading effect in every or any economy. It trickles down, Mr. Speaker. In St. Kitts, when I come from my home in Bird Rock up to last night and I'm going to my home in Bird Rock to last night about 12 o'clock, taxi drivers parked their vehicles on the road to be first in line. To be first in line to get a tour or to go inside the port, Mr. CEO. Mr. Speaker, it has a cascading effect. It trickles down, Mr. Speaker, to the taxi driver. The taxi driver, the hairdressers, the primate vendors, some people call them the monkey vendors, Mr. Speaker.
People with the chairs on the beach.
The people with the chairs on the beach, Mr. Speaker.
That's what they want to make them.
The restaurants, the barbecue vendors, Mr. Speaker. I saw just earlier today an ordinary barbecue vendor on the roundabout there by Port Zante with lobsters on his grill, and chicken, and tourists surrounding the grill, Mr. Speaker. If that don't make the economic sense, I don't know what does, Mr. Speaker. But the construction of this new pier, Mr. Speaker, must benefit the grassroots economy. And that is what TB is all about, Mr. Speaker. Putting people first, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the member from number 3 again misled this honorable House, or he misunderstood the amendments before us, because he read from the Parent Act, Mr. Speaker, and rightly so, about limitation. And the Parent Act, Mr. Speaker, or the amendment, speaks to the amendment, Mr. Speaker, refers to Section 75 limitation, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, what the amendment says, and it's straightforward, elementary again, Mr. Speaker. It says the Act is amended in Section 75 by A, renumbering Section 75 as 75 subsection 1, Mr. Speaker. And subsection 1, B, in subsection 1, replacing the expression where after the commencement of this Act with the expression subject to subsection 2, where after the commencement of this Act. And subsection 1, so 75 1A, Mr. Speaker, will become and will remain and read, the action or legal proceeding shall not be commenced until at least 1 month after written notice containing the particulars of the claim and of intention to commence the action or legal proceeding has been served upon the general manager by the plaintiff or his or her agent. That remains, Mr. Speaker. The only amendment that applies affects 1B, Mr. Speaker. It says, subsection 1B shall not apply to any action or legal proceeding commenced against the authority arising out of, related to, or connected with any borrowing by the authority pursuant to its powers under Section 24 or Section 25. So either he misunderstood, or he's confused, Mr. Speaker, or he's just deliberately misleading the country, as they seem to have a penchant to do, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a lot has been said about this new peer. And there has been a lot said about this new cruise peer. And I believe it is important that the records of this Honorable House be put in an accurate state. Because, Mr. Speaker, you see, the records of this Honorable House must reflect that discussions regarding the construction of the second cruise pier began way back in 2012. Way back in 2012, Mr. Speaker. 6 years ago, at the time when the then administration was in the middle of its 3-year IMF fiscal rebalancing and debt restructuring program. 6 years ago, Mr. Speaker. It was determined back then, Mr. Speaker, that neither Casper nor the government could undertake or could consider undertaking such a large development without attracting a direct foreign investment partner.
Wow. Say it again, man.
It was determined back then again, Mr. Speaker. The records must reflect that back then, when they were under a Douglas Labour Party administration, under or in the middle of its 3-year IMF fiscal rebalancing and debt restructuring program, it was decided that neither Casper nor the Douglas Labour administration could consider undertaking such a large development without attracting a direct foreign investment partner. So what they did? They found a firm called J. Cashman Inc., Mr. Speaker. A foreign firm. J. Cashman Inc. was identified back then and engaged with a view towards establishing a public-private partnership, a 3P, or a PPP, as some people say, as the most viable or most financially viable option that is available to Casper at the time. It must be noted as well, Mr. Speaker, that there was no expression of interest or advertisement for this proposal. There was none, Mr. Speaker. And as the good member, distinguished member from number 7 and the Prime Minister referred to the email and read the content, that the board did not even know. There was no board approval, Mr. Speaker. And the member from number 2, supported by the other members, talking about backroom dealing. Mr. Speaker, after months of discussions and review, it was determined that the PPP option involving equity jointly from J. Cashman and the SIDF will loan funds originating from both local and foreign banks. it was determined that this was the most suitable solution for the financing of the second cruise pier at the time. And you know, Mr. Speaker, truth be told, and we ought to remind the member from number 3 and her colleagues on the opposite side that the Labour regime she was a part of, if they had not squandered the billions of dollars that went through the SIDF, there would have been no need to seek a loan to finance the second cruise pier. There would have been no need to go outside. The SIDF Council could have just closed their eyes literally and give up the $32 million they claim they wanted. They gave some other interested party $16 million, invested in a shell company, or no company at all. Some other interests from SIDF got, what, $40 million US? So you see, that pier could have been easily been financed by the SIDF. But they didn't want that. They had other plans, Mr. Speaker. They had other plans. Because on September the 20th, 2013, SCASPA entered into a tripartite project development agreement with Cruise Port Development, thereafter called the developer, which comprised of joint equity partners, J. Cashman Inc., SIDF, and the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, thereafter called the government, to construct this second cruise pier, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the records must reflect that on the date when the project development agreement was signed, there was an undertaking or an understanding, Mr. Speaker, amongst all parties that all of the conditions precedent to making the PDA, the Project Development Agreement, effective, should be completed within 180 days after the signing of the agreement, and that good faith will prevail in the pursuance of these conditions. But guess what, Mr. Speaker? 2013. So 180 days would take you to March 2014. It was September 2013. The agreement, the conditions should have been met, and then the execution of the project should have started. But what happened, Mr. Speaker? At the end of the 180-day period, ending March 20th, 2014, two critical documents were not executed. The outstanding conditions precedent were the government performance guarantee and the lease for the seabed and riparian rights. Those two documents were not executed, Mr. Speaker. The government performance guarantee and the lease for the seabed and riparian rights. The government performance guarantee was subsequently done by resolution, Mr. Speaker, in Parliament in December 2014, number 24 of 2014. This is the resolution brought to the House. And amongst other things it says, and whereas the Minister of Finance considers it necessary that the government guarantees the obligations of the St. Christopher Area and Seaports Authority to cruise port development for a new pier enhancement work at Port Zante for sums not exceeding $32 million and that is U.S. currency, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, nevertheless, back in July of 2014, SCASPA was advised that J. Cashman, Inc. had indicated that the project development agreement had expired, Mr. Speaker, and it no longer wished to be part of the project. And Mr. Speaker, you talk about corruption, you know. You talk about corruption. Because, you see, Mr. Speaker, although Cashman indicated they were no longer interested in the project, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind those opposite who speak about doubling of pier costs that the breasting dolphin, which was constructed at the Liburd port, expected to cost $5 million. Yes, Mr. Speaker. At the end of its completion, it cost $10 million, Mr. Speaker. If that ain't doubling, I don't know what is, Mr. Speaker. The then developers, a dolphin at the seaport. It was built. That's what Cashman got. Cashman got $10 million for a $5 million dolphin, Mr. Speaker. So no doubt they had enough. The then developers of the second cruise pier, Cashman, was the same company, as I said, who constructed the dolphin for $10 million. I don't know if that's corruption. I don't know if that's corruption. But perhaps when the pact meets, the leader of the opposition can tell us how come that the $5 million dolphin cost $10 million, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, J. Cashman as well also requested compensation of US dollars $750,000 in hard costs, after which it would hand over the drawings and technical reports. Attempts made by the then government to engage other private partners proved to be futile. And Mr. Speaker, the record must also reflect that the agreement with SCASPA, like most agreements, have what we call in local parlance an out clause, a termination clause. Each agreement has that. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Cashman signed the out clause, but SCASPA for some reason did not sign. Did not sign, Mr. Speaker. So who is fooling who? So Cashman claims $750,000 US dollars, Mr. Speaker. Let the record reflect that. Mr. Speaker, the records must also reflect that following the change in government in February 2015, Mr. Speaker, to God be the glory, discussions were subsequently held with Bazarian International Financial Associates, BIFA, and the Canadian Commercial Corporation, a crown agent of the Government of Canada, regarding a government-to-government arrangement. On November 12th, Mr. Speaker, and with the approval of the Cabinet, the entire Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, through the Ministry of Public Infrastructure and Transport, signed a non-binding memorandum of understanding, Mr. Speaker, with the CCC, which provided for government-to-government transactions for the development of this cruise pier, Mr. Speaker. Following the signing of the MOU, and after perusal, Mr. Speaker, the board of SCASPA, and I see members here, the board of SCASPA, Mr. Speaker, forwarded a resolution to the ministry, therein supporting the proposal from the CCC for the financing and construction of the second cruise pier, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April 4, 2016, Mr. Speaker, 5 months thereafter, this is how diligent this cabinet is. This is how transparent this cabinet is, Mr. Speaker. The cabinet considered a submission from my ministry outlining the rationale for the construction of this cruise pier. The submission also included, Mr. Speaker, results from an analysis of the proposals presented by BIFA and CCC, Mr. Speaker. And given the results of the analysis, a recommendation was made to engage the CCC to design and construct this pier and to assist with procuring of the project financing. Mr. Speaker, Cabinet also demanded or mandated an independent review of the financial evaluation model, Mr. Speaker. And SCASPA engaged EY, Ernst & Young, a global leader in assurance, tax, transaction, and advisory services. Upon completion, Cabinet further decided that it should do a value for money analysis, a risk analysis, Mr. Speaker. And SCASPA confirmed. And this was completed 6 months after, in November 2016. So, Mr. Speaker, all our due diligence efforts were made, Mr. Speaker. So when they come here, Mr. Speaker, and talk about corruption, Mr. Speaker, I'm somewhat cautious to even respond, but you have to. But as I said before in this honorable House, and it bears repeating, and I know the leader is listening, he headed a government in this country that was the face of corruption. I went through that so many times. How many more times must I repeat that in order for him to stop talking about corruption? It's like the kettle calling the pot black. You know, that's what it said? The pot calling the kettle black. And Mr. Speaker, to tell you the truth, Mr. Speaker, there's an old saying that it ain't for want to tongue why cattle don't talk. Because, Mr. Speaker, you've heard what the member opposite did, Mr. Speaker. You heard that the member opposite attacked myself and my son Mikhail, right? And I must remind this country, Mr. Speaker, that months before the elections, I saw my son lying in blood in the yard with gunshot wounds across his chest. And Mr. Speaker, till this date, people have presented to me all sorts of theories. They reminded me of the dread up the village, who, when he wanted his money, and approached the member from number 6. And his own colleague said this, the former member from number 3. He said, in 2 or 3 days, the dread was shot to death, Mr. Speaker. But God is a good God, and my son survived, Mr. Speaker. He survived his physical injuries. So I want to say to the country and to the member opposite that no attacks on myself and my son, no scurrilous attacks or defamatory, offensive, or malicious remarks would faze me. Because, Mr. Speaker, I spoke in this country when you had to stand alone if you spoke the truth. And I stood alone and spoke the truth to the member opposite from number 6. And I'm standing here, and he's sitting over there. And he will be there for a long time to come. And long meaning a few months, Mr. Speaker. I won't tell you why. The whole world knows that that passport issue will be his Achilles heel, I call it. That will be his Achilles heel, Mr. Speaker. But I want to say, Mr. Speaker, there is no involvement of either myself or my son in the construction of the second cruise pier. What is more is the reality, Mr. Speaker, that neither my ministry nor SCASPA has any role whatsoever in the selection of contractors or subcontractors or indeed the procurement of materials. This is exclusively the responsibility of the Canadian Commercial Corporation, Mr. Speaker. The records must reflect that. Mr. Speaker, the bill before us, Mr. Speaker, and we've heard, I mean, we went through the letter before. I need not repeat it. I need not repeat the traitorous, attempts of the member opposite. But I would still contend that he ought to be taken to Independence Square and be flogged for his attempt to stop one of the major projects in this country. Mr. Speaker, we inherited a country that was under the leadership of the member from number 6 for 20 years, Mr. Speaker. The member from number 7 spoke to the crumbling infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. Our roads, our buildings, the airport, Mr. Speaker, the airport runway. We're going to spend $6 million to resurface the runway. The lighting, Mr. Speaker, the echo report is damning. And that's what we inherited from the failed administration of the member opposite, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, when they come here, Mr. Speaker, and try to mislead the country, you have to tell them like it is. But you see, the problem is, Mr. Speaker, for 20 years, they mismanaged the monies in the SIDF. And we came in, and in 3 years, we balanced the budget. Kudos to the Minister of Finance. Surplus, and more surplus, Mr. Speaker. And what we're doing with the surplus, we're giving it back to the ordinary man. Double salary, 2016, double salary, 2017. And if you apply the laws of probability, we'll have double salary, 2018. Minister? Silence is consent, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we are managing the economy. I am no economist, But I hear them talk about economic growth. What, 6%, you know? But I don't understand, if you have such economic growth, but they have so much debt, right? How could you have economic growth on one hand and you have debt? If you have economic growth, you should be able to stimulate your economy and give people work. If you have debt, if you have no economic growth, beg your pardon, then you spend money. You incur debt to stimulate the economy. So I don't understand this theory. I'm not an economist. I'm not going there, Mr. Speaker. But something has to be wrong when you hear them on the radio talking about 6% economic growth, but they were the highest debtor country in the world. It doesn't add up, Mr. Speaker. That does not add up, Mr. Speaker. But let me stick to what I know. I don't know economics, Mr. Speaker, but that just don't add up. Mr. Speaker, what is happening in this country, Mr. Speaker, is progress. We are modernizing the country. We are developing the country. Just yesterday, the Prime Minister flipped the switch for the traffic lights or the traffic signals. And what when people, eh?
Yes.
People.
Hundreds upon hundreds.
Culture come earlier, can
Culture come earlier, according to my colleague, Mr. Speaker. And you know what the people are saying to us, Mr. Speaker? We want phase 2, you know, of the lighting. Remember from number 7, phase 2.
All the way, but don't want.
Mr. Speaker, you know, because we have done the traffic counts, we have done the traffic survey, and a report is there. I think it's over 250 pages, a volume, which tells us where we should put more signals, what streets should be no parking, or one way, Mr. Speaker. And we have seen development. Traffic signals improve the safety on the roads, Mr. Speaker. Not only for drivers, but for pedestrians as well, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker,
Use the work of the police.
of course, deploy the police elsewhere. Deploy them elsewhere. Anguilla got lights. St. Martin got lights, Mr. Speaker. Antigua got lights. Grenada got lights. Barbados got lights. Trinidad and Jamaica got lights. Ain't time seconds stop lagging behind. The number 1 country in the world. In the region we got lights. Come on. You must support that, Mr. Speaker. The member said that it bears repeating that for 20 years of a Labour administration, the old road bay continued to be a hazardous journey for all the thousands of people who commute on that network daily. A little rainfall, rock slippage, and I have to repeat it, Mr. Speaker. It gets close to my heart because a young man from Newtown, Dennis Mully, one Sunday afternoon was killed by a rock that came down from Old Road Bay. And my commitment was, when we come into government, we'll fix that problem once and for all. And I want to thank my colleagues for supporting the Old Road Bay Rehabilitation Project, Mr. Speaker. And come April, the tenders will go out. The designs will be completed. Some additional work has been done. The bathymetric studies will be completed. And we will have an Old Road Bay that is safe to all commuters. Come next year, Mr. Speaker, about April. The folks in East Bastion, Mr. Speaker, we heard of the bus terminal. The people on Brand Street,
When will that start?
the bus storm has already started, the phase 1. The building came in here on January the 12th, the prefab building. And it's almost completed. I mean, to take a visit there, Mr. Prime Minister, next week, your time permitting, and the cabinet as well. And you normally walk with your cameras, right? And we will, and that's not the laughing matter, Mr. Speaker. It is fact, because you have to document. You have to document these things. Because when these people put the nonsense on social media, you have to counter it with the facts, Mr. Speaker. The prefab building will be completed in April this year. We anticipate that the relocation will be completed by May of this year, and in earnest, we will deal with the actual terminal construction at the Vehicles Maintenance Division of the Public Works Department thereafter, and we expect to complete that project, hopefully, for our Independence gift. I've mandated the Director of Public Works that this has to be completed for our 35th anniversary of independence. East Bastia and the country, those who plied the East Bus Line route from Bastia right down to Deep Bear Saddlers, Mr. Speaker, they will have a spanking brand new bus terminal, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I did not want to address it, but I have to, because it came to the Parliament today, and the member opposite was talking about water. And Mr. Speaker, the Water Services Department sent out a release to the nation, to the public, which reads, dated the 12th of February 2018. And it says, water consumers in St. Peter's, New Road, Pine Gardens, Gillard, and Shadwell communities have been experiencing water service interruptions since Friday, the 9th of February. This was due to a defective motor and pump at the Taylor's Well, which supplies water to these communities. And this is the second occurrence in the past 6 years. Our challenge, it continues this time around, is that we do not have spares that meet the specifications for this well. The Water Service Department technicians spent all of Sunday substituting a pump motor combination from another well into the Taylor's Well. St. Peter's and surrounding areas will now only receive 67% of their normal flow. Based on the above, it continues, rationing from 10 to 5 a.m. will have to be instituted in the areas concerned for at least the next 2 weeks, effective from the 12th of February. The expected time of arrival on spares ordered in October 2017 is February the 19th, Mr. Speaker. I asked the manager water engineer, Mr. Paul, who is a hard-working civil servant, why is it there were no spares? And he said to me that these pumps are normally manufactured to specification, so there's not normal any spares on the shelf you can just buy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's imperative, though, that I apologize on behalf of the department and the ministry to those in the areas I just outlined for the inconvenience that they are experiencing. Because it's very strange, Mr. Speaker, with all the rain falling, some people don't have water. But it's because our wells are underground and have to pump the water up, and there's a malfunctioning pump. But, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite must remember that in 2009, Ocean Earth Technologies were engaged to look at the Bastia Valley aquifer. And their first task, Mr. Speaker, was a geophysical investigation for the emergency hydrogeologic evaluation of the upper watershed. And I believe that we must understand that the water or the aquifer is not over the ponds and inlets. That's the aquifer well field. Because the aquifer actually starts at Olive's Mountain in the west, delineated by the Canada Hills in the northeast and the Connery Hills in the east. And the water comes all the way down underground and settles in the ponds needless area in what we call the well field. When it's saturated, Mr. Speaker, you see the guts start running. The Odgie gut, the College Street gut, the Westbourne gut. And it's something that I've mandated, again, the Water Services Department, is to find a way how to dam the water, Mr. Speaker. When it first came up, the reaction was damming of the water is expensive because you have to treat it. But I say here, again, and I say publicly, the cost is not the call of the technicians or the technocrats. The cost must be the decision of the cabinet. They must bring the information, and we will determine whether it's worth the while to dam that water instead of having to run to the sea. We can find it or find other use for that water, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, they were warned. The incompetent representative from number one was warned way back in 2009, Mr. Speaker. He was warned back then that the recommendation, the strong recommendation, was to move forward to the phase 2 investigation due to the threat of salt water intrusion into the Bastia Valley aquifer well field. And this was predicted in 2009. It was predicted by OET that if the pumping from the well field continued at its 2009 withdrawal rates, then the well field would experience salt water intrusion in the Bastia Valley aquifer. So said, so done. But the incompetent minister of infrastructure and water that time did absolutely nothing. But that's enough for water, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, as we wrap on this bill, Mr. Speaker, very important bill, Mr. Speaker, and as I said as well, Mr. Speaker, that the First Amendment is to Section 24, which outlines the borrowing powers of SCASPA. The Second Amendment is to Section 75, which deals with time limits for bringing actions against SCASPA. The Third Amendment is to Section 76, Mr. Speaker, which deals with limitations on execution against property of the authority, SCASPA. And the Fourth Amendment is to Section 78 of the Act, which deals with transfer of assets, meaning property, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will note, Mr. Speaker, that these amendments apply, I believe I said it before, to cases, or mainly cases of borrowing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there have been articles surfacing by the opposition side regarding these amendments and talks about increased pay costs. But I want to reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that the increase in costs to this project is due to this administration's foresight, Mr. Speaker, and the redoing or completing of the plans associated with this new cruise pier. Mr. Speaker, it was in 2014, Mr. Speaker, I did mention CMH Hill that spoke to CH2M Hill, sorry, Mr. Speaker, that spoke to the incompletion of the plans. And the records will reflect. And I quote here, Mr. Speaker, our estimate is based on the partially complete plans prepared for J. Cashman Inc. by JMT, dated January 21, 2014, as provided to us by Uric Dorset. It goes on. In some cases, the quantities vary from the estimate provided, Mr. Speaker, likely because the original estimate predated the current plans. Our cost review, Mr. Speaker, it goes on, did not include any structural design calculations to evaluate the elements of the design, such as pile diameter, thickness, or embedment concrete enforcement, fenders, or moorings. This is what's in the record, Mr. Speaker. This is in the record. And what we did as a responsible administration, Mr. Speaker, what we did, we went to the technical committee of the Florida Cruise Caribbean Association, the FCCA, and presented these plans, got the input from the committee in terms of the improvements we want on this new pier. Because it makes no economic sense, Mr. Speaker, if you had a ship, an Oasis class ship, if it came alongside, then another ship may not have been able to berth because of the width of the pier and the configuration and structure of the Oasis class ship. So what we did, Mr. Speaker, we went and, upon the advice of the committee, widened the pier, lengthened the pier, agreed to do some dredging alongside the pier to accommodate two of the Oasis class ships, Mr. Speaker. If that is not economic sense, then what is, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, the $48 million, a matter of fact, it's $41.5 or $6 million for the construction of the pier, which increased after the hurricanes and the increase of the materials just after September. But the other $16 million, Mr. Speaker, sorry, $7 million, Mr. Speaker, involves the procurement of a tug, and the enhancement of the Amina market, the upscale of land development, Mr. Speaker, which includes the enhancement of the Amina market, Mr. Speaker. So this is money well spent, will be well spent, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I wish to state, though, that this exercise today is an exercise in ensuring that this project is executed within the four walls of transparency and good governance, Mr. Speaker. Every process by which decisions were made and process by which these decisions were implemented was sound. Sound, Mr. Speaker, and within the parameters of transparency and good governance. Mr. Speaker, the construction agreement made under the government arrangement between the government of St. Kitts Nevis and the government of Canada clearly stipulates that the loan agreement, which was signed in November 2017, on November 22nd to be exact, 2017, it says that the loan agreement shall be completed within 120 days of or after the signing. And I can report, Mr. Speaker, that all conditions precedent to the disbursement of the loan, the monies, the funds, have been met, save and except one, which entails the exercise we are doing today, Mr. Speaker, to wit, the amendment to the St. Christopher Air and Seaports Authority Act. I want to make the point in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, that it is the first time ever a local syndicate was put together to finance any major project in St. Kitts and Nevis. And this is commendable, Mr. Speaker. This is commendable. Just under $130 million, easy dollars, or US dollars, $48 million, is being funded by the St. Kitts, Nevis and Guyana National Bank in the amount of $34 million US dollars. The Social Security Board in the amount of $7 million US dollars. The Sugar Investment Diversification Foundation, SIDF, in the amount of US $5 million, and the TDC, your company, in the amount of $2 million US dollars. Mr. Speaker, we have said that this new cruise pier will accommodate two of the largest ships that are afloat today, and simultaneously. We made mention of the short-sightedness of the rejected Labour administration. The design only accommodated one ship, Mr. Speaker.
The vote is yours, the vote is mine.
Mr. Speaker, when you hear the nonsense peddled by the other side, dismiss it as just pure nonsense. Imagine, they say we want to sell the pier. When the Cashman deal, the port would have been leased for 30 years.
Not under the control of the
30 years. Scasper couldn't control it. Scasper would have had to give up all the head tax, the passenger fee, for 30 years.
Now we keep it and his hours now.
Scasper would have had to insure the facility. And the insurance proceeds would have been made payable to the company, to Cashman. But who knows what state the port would have been in after 30 days.
When they get back after 2 days,
But that's an invisible sale. That has to be an invisible sale of the port of Scottsboro. Scottsboro not going to own everything, but Scottsboro has to avoid collateral. If you take my money, but I got to get some kind of indemnity. I got to get some kind of protection, ain't so? Exactly. If you buy a car, you finance the car, I got a bill of sale, they call it.
yeah.
A house. You got a mortgage. But Mr. Speaker, what I can say though, in conclusion, is that the construction of this new pier, again, it bears repeating, will positively impact upon the grassroots economy of St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Speaker, as I said before, and I must repeat it, that we as a team unity government can assure the country that the implementation process thus far falls within the parameters of transparency and good governance. Mr. Speaker, back then, when I was a permanent secretary in the government and the National Bank or the government were negotiating monies to start the last crop, I remember in 2005 what they were about. The then manager, former Governor General, I remember him whispering to the member from number 6, Mr. Prime Minister, you are not keeping the bank in a bankable position. That's what they did with National Bank. It was not in a bankable position. That's why the land for debt swap came up. But that's for another story, another day, Mr. Speaker. But I can conclude as well that this syndicate loan is a complex facility. And SCASPA, the financiers, the lawyers, and the government have taken the time to make sure that we got it right, Mr. Speaker. We have taken the time. I want to therefore reassure the people of this country and beyond that when we will have completed the financial arrangements and the final construction of this new cruise pier facility, this project will stand up to the test of public scrutiny in St. Kitts, Nevis, and anywhere in the world. And that is the problem, Mr. Speaker. That's why there's a problem. They could not do it, and we are going to do it, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to safe passage in this honorable House. May it please you, sir.
Stay up to date with news, programs, and activities of the government with SKNIS. Like us on Facebook. Listen to us on SoundCloud. Follow us on Twitter. And watch our videos on YouTube. Connect with us today. SKNIS, St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service.